Is there a split taking place in monetary policy, or do you think behind the scenes something is coming together where the Fed is looking at a situation where strength in US dollar is not going to be the path from here in 2016?
So I think, there are two issues. One, there's the international issue of sort of the Fed on a tightening path and many other countries going on a loosening path. And then within the Fed, I think there are different views of how likely it is that inflation is going to heat up. Some people are very cautious and have said, well, certainly the unemployment rate has come down significantly, but we still really haven't seen evidence of wage pressure. Others, like Lacker, focusing on some of the recent numbers in CPI and the Consumer Price Index and Personal Consumption Index, saying expenditure index, suggesting, well, maybe there is a little bit more pressure. We don't really know. I think perfectly reasonable people could disagree because this is kind of uncharted territory.
It's funny as we talk about just how connected the Fed board is at this point. They're pretty much on the same page for the most they've been for months, if you look at some of the dot plots, for instance. So are people making too much of the fact that there's discord among the FOMC?
Yeah, I think people always have different views around that table. It's never perfectly consistent, and I think, as I said, reasonable people can disagree about where inflation is going to go because it's unusual how inflation has operated so far, and so you could say, well, we're going to go back to normal circumstances where we would see more wage pressure. We can say that's just not the right model to be using anymore, but I think you're going to have differences of views, and I think they're going to move cautiously.
Let's get your view then. Where do you think we are on inflation, and how many interest rates can we weather stateside this year?
So I don't see the inflation pressure yet, particularly because I don't see it on the wage side. I think it's very reasonable that the Fed is trying to anticipate where it's going to go, and they've taken the one rate rise so that they can try to be ahead of the curve rather than behind the curve. But I think they have to wait for more concrete evidence of actual inflation itself and movement back up of inflation expectations before moving boldly.
And one big factor they're watching to try and determine whether or not this is just a temporary effects of inflation is the oil price as well.
For sure.
Do you think it's too early to call this bottom in the oil price?
Yeah, I'm not calling the particulars in the oil market. As we see, there's a lot of volatility, and that's one of the reasons why the Fed tends to strip out the more volatile food and energy sectors, because there are very big movements in energy prices that may not really tell us about where inflation is going over the intermediate to longer run.
What about some of the other factors we don't talk about as much? When we talk about the technological change being more of a permanent factor, even the sharing economy, you could say,
sure, having
inflation pressures to the downside here. Do you think that is having a real impact?
So there's a big debate over whether we're mismeasuring GDP, we're mismeasuring prices. I think there's some of that, but I wouldn't say that's the main factor that's driving the low inflation outcomes.